Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Water for Life, Not Wall Street water webinar. Before we get started, I'm just going to take a moment and run through a few tips for using Zoom today. So the first is that you have been muted, but we do want to hear from you. So please use the chat box to get started by introducing yourself, letting us know where you're joining from, and why you're here today or what you're hoping to get out of this webinar. We do have closed captions available for this webinar. You can turn those on by clicking live transcript at the bottom of your screen, and then you can adjust your subtitle settings there. This event is being recorded so that we can send it out to you all after the event. And it is also live on our Facebook, so you can go there directly after if you missed something and want to go and learn more. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me, Megan, in the chat box, or at megan@wellingtonwaterwatchers.ca is my email. And if you are joining us over the phone and you have questions for the speakers, you can please email them to me and we'll make sure they're asked. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Arlene Silcombe, the Executive Director of the Water Watchers, to get us started.
Good morning, everyone. The places that we will be referring to on this webinar today, where Nestlé and now Triton are extracting groundwater for profit, and where many of us call home, are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples, currently under the Haldimand Tract Treaty and Treaty 3 with the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations. Each successive land acknowledgement that I give, I find myself reflecting more and more about my responsibilities as a treaty person and as a guest on these lands. This land acknowledgement is a renewal of my responsibility to learn and practice reconciliation and learn and practice the conduct laid out within the treaties. In extending my gratitude and acknowledgement to these lands and waters and her caretakers, I renew my conviction to learn more about the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, the Silver Chain of Friendship Covenant, and the Two-Row Wampum that hold within them the blueprint for me to be a good guest here. The Dish with One Spoon Treaty tells us that there is abundance here if we treat it respectfully. The dish is full if we are careful. It also instructs that we must only take what we need and leave the rest for others, including the non-human world, and that we must leave the dish clean. The Silver Chain of Friendship Covenant shows us that chains of friendship can be formed between settler peoples and the Haudenosaunee peoples. Chains, usually made of iron, are susceptible to rust, so a chain of silver is preferred and requires polishing from time to time to renew the stability and beauty of the chain. These agreements or treaties require periodic renewals accompanied by gifts and aid to the Haudenosaunee. This was known as polishing the silver chain. The Two-Row Wampum agreements talk about our nations rowing in boats side by side down the river of life together. In this relationship, we can interact with one another, help and assist one another, but not dominate or control the other. These are very surface and brief interpretations of these treaties. And as a settler, I'm committed to acknowledging the impacts of colonization on these lands and waters and on her caretakers. As a settler, I'm a participant in this process of colonization, and I have a responsibility to learn more about these agreements and to enact these codes of conduct. When reflecting on the topic of this webinar today, it is apparent to me that our colonial government that assumes the authority to issue permits on these traditional lands is acting completely outside of these treaties and agreements. And it is our responsibility to hold us all accountable. The renewal request for these permits are an opportunity for us to renew our convictions as guests on these lands and to call our government to end and step into honoring the agreements of these lands.
Thank you, Arlene. My name is Mike Balkwell. I work with the Water Watchers in the role of campaign director. Very happy to have you all here today. We're going to be talking about the new Nestlé, the acquisition by Nestlé Waters Canada and Nestlé North America by private equity firms in the United States. We're going to give you some background on that. We're going to talk about the issues, and we're going to talk about our strategy going forward. I was thinking as Megan was introducing us, when she said that this is the Wellington Water Watchers Water for Life, Not Wall Street webinar, that this really is a webinar where you practice your W's. We're going to be practicing our W's all day long, or our W's, as my son said when he was young. I'm going to give just a little bit of background to get started. First of all, you can see behind me the signs from the protest we did 2 years ago in the before times, before the pandemic at Aberfoyle, where Makasha Looking Horse and clan mothers from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Council issued a cease and desist order to Nestlé. So that's what's behind me. And maybe you can see my fancy t-shirt I'm wearing here that says "All Eyes on Nestlé." And many of you, I know, participated in a series of events that we held in November of 2019, again, just before the pandemic, where we gathered in Guelph representatives from several communities around the United States, and as well as here in Guelph, who were opposing Nestlé's water taking. Out of that informal network that the Water Watchers helped bring together has developed something that's called the Troubled Waters Coalition. And you'll be hearing a little bit more about that later in the discussion today. The Franklin Frederick is an activist from Brazil who was active in opposing Nestlé water taking successfully at a community in Brazil. And as part of that work, he was became engaged in Switzerland, engaged in opposing Nestlé there. He stayed in Switzerland. He's now a dual resident, a dual citizen, pardon me. And Franklin was part of the All Eyes on Nestlé tour. And I'm struck, I remember he told a story, which I'm going to tell you, and you can decide whether you want to believe it or not. But he said that he didn't think it was a coincidence that within months of that big event that we had here, Nestlé announced they were going to sell their North American operations. And Franklin's perspective was, it was the first time that communities had come together in North America to oppose Nestlé, and that Nestlé just couldn't afford to have public opposition from countries in the global north, from the wealthier industrialized societies. That in the global south, there are many, many more barriers to people organizing to oppose Nestlé's water taking. But they just couldn't handle the risk to their brand of that happening in the north. And that for him, he said that's part of what he thinks triggered their decision to sell. Now, I don't know if that's true. I know Maud Barlow's listening in. I know Maud Barlow has been a terrific water warrior for decades. She and the Council of Canadians have done terrific work. All of us together as allies in resisting Nestlé have brought us to this point where they have sold. And that's good news. That's something I think we should all feel good about and feel that we have all contributed towards. However, the threat continues, and we're going to explore that today. In just a few moments, I'm going to introduce Rod Whitlow from Six Nations on the Grand, who's going to talk about First Nation water rights in general, and specifically talk about issues around the continued water taking in Wellington County by the company called Blue Triton. Samantha Demby is a researcher and a writer and a community organizer, and the Troubled Waters Coalition that I mentioned to you earlier, and which is supported and receiving leadership as well from the Story of Stuff project based in California, supported Sam to do research into Blue Triton. And so Sam's going to take us into the details, more of the details of this acquisition and some of the implications of that. And then finally, some of you will know this already, others it'll be news to you, but Shane Phillips, who's a longtime friend and supporter of the Water Watchers, did a 1-week walk last week. He walked 89 kilometers in a circuit from Guelph to the Aberfoyle bottling plant, to the Middlebrook well, and to the Hillsburg well, to bring attention to the issues. And 10 years ago, Shane walked from Guelph to Queen's Park to bring attention to Nestlé's water taking. And it wasn't the first time he'd done that walk. So we're very pleased that Shane did that walk again this year to bring attention to the issues. And that walk to Nestlé's, Shane's going to highlight that for us. The format of this webinar is that each person will speak, and we invite you to put any questions you have, as well as any comments you may have in response to the speaker, into the chat box. And after each speaker, I will stop and pose those questions to the speaker for them to answer. We'll be sure over the course of this hour and a half or 2 hours that we answer all questions. And we've also invited our speakers to answer questions through the chat box, and we invite you to speak to each other. You too will have comments or answers in response to the questions, and we really invite you to do that in the chat box. As Megan mentioned at the opening, this is being recorded. The chat box is recorded as well, and we'll share that all back to you. Often when we do this, people put links in the chat box to resources that address some of the issues being discussed, and we encourage you to do all of that. We miss not being able to be in a real room together to enjoy each other's company and to share each other's energy, and we do the best we can to promote that kind of engagement through the chat box. I think I want to say one more thing before I invite Rod to the stage. And it relates to the strategy of the Water Watchers strategy and what we're doing. The Ontario government and the Ministry of the Environment have deliberately restricted the view of the water taking issue to a very narrow set of criteria, to a very narrow lens. They asked the question, does taking water affect the environment? Does it affect the water, does it affect the sustainability of the water that's being taken? And they exclude and make external to that all other issues. And there are a whole host of issues which we're going to review. And you'll know that there was a moratorium for the last 4 years, that the Ministry of Environment retained consultants to do scientific studies, quote unquote, and they came to the conclusion that it wasn't really impacting the water. Now, we challenged that, and we challenged that because there's really no serious way of measuring that's been undertaken the cumulative impact of water taking on aquifers. And we know that aquifers take decades, sometimes generations, sometimes centuries to recharge. And there really isn't, the science hasn't really created a water budget that accounts for how much water is there and how much it takes to recharge. And with the issue of water, like lots of issues around the climate crisis today and the environmental crisis, it's like having a checking account, a bank account where you can write checks, but you don't know what your balance is. And the issue of bankruptcy, the issue of what I'd like to call environmental bankruptcy, isn't clear until you run out. And it's attributed to Hemingway, that Hemingway said about bankruptcy is a process that is gradual until it's sudden. And our deep fear is that we're gradually running out of water, which we will suddenly discover. And that the precautionary principle would say that taking water for bottling is the lowest priority use, particularly in communities that have reliable public water systems. So that really it's the most frivolous use to take water from the ground where it's in reserve for future generations' use, put it in plastic bottles, one-use plastic bottles that a company like Nestlé and now Blue Triton can profit from while discarding their plastic garbage upon the rest of us. So to come back to the strategy part, although the ministry restricts their view to this very narrow issue, and while we're in the period of time where we're being invited to make submissions to the Environmental Registry of Ontario about their permit to take water, and while they're only considering very narrow feedback about the technical aspects and the technical impact of water taking, we want to expand that focus. We want to keep pushing that focus out. And today, those are the issues that we're going to cover. I've probably made my friends, Megan, Danny, and Horeen, who are doing the work behind me, a little disorganized here because I went on to my rant, well, not my rant, pardon me, my introduction without cueing them. So if we could just advance the slides a little bit, there's a couple more points I want to make to set the stage for our speakers. Blue Triton acquired Nestlé North America, which includes Nestlé Waters Canada. In Wellington County, that's 3 wells, the bottling plant and well in Aberfoyle, the well in Hillsburg, and the well in Middlebrook. They also own a bottling plant and a well in Hope, BC. Here in Wellington County, as part of Ontario's, the Ontario government, they've applied, Blue Triton has applied for a permit to take water for bottling for a 10-year period. It's interesting that in the past 10 or 15 years, Nestlé has only been able to have a 5-year permit. So this is really quite a greedy grab on the part of Blue Triton to go for a 10-year permit. And we're going to tell you some more later about what's problematic about that. Next slide, please. The Nestlé's Canada, Nestlé North America has been purchased by 2 private equity firms, OneRock Capital and Metropolous Company. It's a $4.2 billion acquisition. The majority of that is junk bonds and a line of credit and about $1 billion of their own cash. And Sam Demby, as I mentioned, is going to take us deeper into that part of the story and discuss the implications of that with us. Next slide, please. It's interesting, representatives of Nestlé were quoted in the local newspaper as saying it's business as usual. All of the Nestlé's Waters Canada staff have been transitioned to the Blue Triton. Blue Triton says in the communities all around North America, they're saying the only thing that's different is the ownership. It's business as usual. And we're going to talk about how it's not business as usual. There's a drum on this screen and I don't know why. Is that a clue to me to speed up? Can anybody else see the drum on the screen? There we go. So you just got a little bit ahead of me. Just back up 1 slide, please. Oh, no, here we are, pardon me. So it's not, but it's not business as usual. There continues to be no consent from First Nations for this water taking. Here, I got distracted by the drumming there for a minute. I'm going to reboot here. So it's not business as usual, and we're going to talk about why the ownership by Triton is an ominous and dangerous development. Sorry, yeah, stay there. Thank you. So the part that is still business as usual is they're continuing to take water without consent from First Nations, that they continue to take 600 million liters a year from the aquifer, and that the recharge rate takes generations. Next slide, please. And the plastic pollution persists. I know these numbers are huge, but Nestlé and now Blue Triton, if Blue Triton takes as much water every year as Nestlé took last year, they'll produce 3.5 million 500 milliliter bottles per day. Now, again, these are big, big numbers, but just for a second, I want you to imagine that if you took a 500 milliliter bottle, you took that empty bottle and you laid it end to end. In the 2 hours that it took Shane to walk from Guelph to the Aberfoyle plant, you could lay enough bottles in a row to extend from the Aberfoyle bottling plant to the door of Doug Ford's constituency office, 65 kilometers. Every hour of every day, there's about 35 kilometers of plastic bottles being produced end to end. And I'm sure you see those in your neighborhood, in the street, in the parks, etc., where they get abandoned as litter. In addition, there's the problem of microplastics. They break down to microplastics, which is bad for human health, for wildlife, and for aquatic life. And the carbon footprint of producing bottles from beginning to end, because it's an extension of the fossil fuel industry, is enormous. Next slide, please. So that's kind of the setting. We're going to go into this in more detail. There may be questions in the chat box. I was talking, so I didn't see them. I'll catch up with them. I'm very pleased to invite to the screen now Rod Whitlow. Rod's going to give you a little more formal introduction about his background, but we've been working, I think, Rod, we met about 4 years ago in Michigan at an event where Maud Barlow was the keynote speaker as part of something we called the Water is Life Alliance, which was initiated by the Council of Canadians and brought together groups in Michigan and Ontario that were fighting Nestlé. And we've been, Rod's a member of Six Nations, and we've been working closely together ever since then around Nestlé. And we're very pleased that Rod can be here and join with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Rod.
Sago, good morning, everyone. Greetings from Ohsweken, which is here in Six Nations of the Grand River, Southern Ontario. I just wanted to thank very much the organizers for this event, and especially the Wellington Water Watchers, who've been very supportive of a lot of the water security issues that we're facing here at Six Nations in the Grand River watershed. And I guess in North America as well, we've got some good dialogue with other folks, grassroots organizations and throughout North America dealing with the issue of water security and extractive industries such as the bottling water industry and the export. So I just wanted to also acknowledge the fact that today we normally typically start our day with the Thanksgiving address and greetings to the natural world, and that has taken place. There's been sunrise ceremonies, I understand, today, because some of you may be aware that the 133 First Nations are gathered this week and this morning, and they went through a process to elect a new or select a new Ontario regional chief. So there's a number of resolutions that they're dealing with today, but yesterday they selected Glenn Hare, so he's going to be the new Ontario regional chief. And I'll get to that a little bit more in my presentation as to the role that I played there in the Secretariat office. But I just wanted to get back to the greetings and to the natural world and the Thanksgiving and the reverence that Indigenous people have for water and all of creation. So you'll hear a lot of stories, I guess, from around the world whereby Indigenous people are actually not neglecting the personhood of water and the important role that it plays in all of creation, all of life. So there's a sacredness and a reverence there for water that is universal throughout Indigenous communities around the world. So they typically, what we would do in these types of gatherings, we would open it up with greetings to the natural world, and then we would have a water ceremony if we were in Anishinaabe territory. So the one slide that I don't think that we have it on there, but some of you probably have been aware that back in 2004, and it was revised again in back 2010, there was a First Nations water declaration that the First Nations in Ontario articulated and transcribed based on some cultural teachings and philosophies and ethics that form the foundation of our traditions and our culture. And so you can find that declaration online. The focus of it is, it talks about the responsibility that we all have, the kinship and the relationship that we have with the natural world, the instructions and the gifts that we got from the Creator, and making sure that we protect the water so that it can fulfill its original instructions. It's not just human life, but all life forms that rely on water. So that is in keeping with the theme of this event, and that water is life. So as I mentioned, I did work at the Chiefs of Ontario in the Secretariat office, and during that time, going back maybe 6 or between 6 years ago and 3 years ago, there were a number of resolutions that were passed. So these resolutions were from the 133 First Nations in the province of Ontario. The first one came out when the Dalton McGuinty Kathleen Wynne government, and Glenn Murray was the Minister of the Environment at the time. They introduced a new regulation under the Ontario Water Resources Act, and they were going to finally increase the amount that these water bottle companies pay from $3.71 to $503.71, and they put it on the EBR, which is the Environmental Bill of Rights, for their minimum duration. I think it was probably maybe not even 60 days or 90 days. So they fast tracked it because, again, at that time, there was a lot of public awareness about the use of plastic bottles. And there was a campaign that started in the upper reaches of the Grand River. And that actually ignited and brought a lot of solidarity from folks concerned about the prolific use of plastics and where they end up in waterways. And then also with the massive amount of water that was being extracted. So Mike's touched on that quite a bit in his opening remarks. So I won't go too much into that part of it. But what I did want to take the time to share is that there are First Nations laws, philosophies, and environmental ethics that pursue and respect and revere the role that water plays in all of our lives. So those two resolutions, I believe one was in the first one came in 2017, and then there was another one in 2018. So the Chiefs in Assembly basically realized that this was going to be a major concern and on the water security aspect. So the provincial ministry of also acknowledged that there was going to be some startling changes as a result of climate change, and then Mike touched on the fact that there's scientific uncertainty, so they're not even following their own precautionary principles. When they did their last review to justify the ending of the moratorium, they hired an engineering coalition, and they hired a consultant. And I had the opportunity to review that upon invitation with Wellington Water Watchers. But they did have an external working group, and it was just a handful of First Nations representatives on that working group, with water bottle proponents also sitting at the table. So, my concern was that it was just a crisscross. It was just like a haphazard assessment of whether there's going to be enough groundwater. For my particular community, which is in Southern Ontario, we're surrounded by what's just called a geological formation called the Haldeman Clay Plain. So we know scientifically that in order for those aquifers to recharge and where there's clay, it's going to take a lot longer than it would be if it was sand or silt. So I brought up these types of circumstances, and I wrote repeatedly to the Provincial Ministry of the Environment, not only at the staff level, the director level, but also to the ministers quite a few times. I think they got irritated with me, and they just began to ignore me. And they would try to justify, say, well, we got the engineering company to take a look at a few watersheds across the province, and there's going to be enough water for everyone. Again, they just totally ignored their own precautionary principles. There was scientific uncertainty. Even in close to Six Nations here, there's a small village called Mount Pleasant, which has groundwater. And it was last year that there wasn't enough precipitation in the winter. So in order to supply their water, they actually had to put water restrictions. So I asked those types of questions. So the point being is that now with the ending of the provincial moratorium, they've created a new regulation under the Ontario Water Resources Act, and they've actually increased the threshold for water bottle companies to extract, because they're so confident that their science is accurate. They're not worried at all about errors and omissions in that science. The Doug Ford government is so pleased to just go ahead and allow these permits to continue. They've completely excluded Indigenous people and First Nations from that decision-making matrix. And I put that in my written submissions to the standing committee, or back in the fall, so folks can find that and take a look at it. And then, so then fast forward, we have we have a youth campaign. So Makasha Looking Horse, as Mike mentioned, has been spearheading that campaign, and the clan mothers. And so there's a traditional role for women to make sure that we have enough water for our current use and for our future generations. So that's there. And then our traditional hereditary government, so the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Council of Chiefs, have also declared a moratorium on development across the Haldimand Deed, which is the 1784 treaty that the Haudenosaunee, Mohawks, and others received in return for their assistance with the British during the respective wars. So, and then we had the 1701 Nanfan Treaty, which is our beaver hunting territory that covers most of southern Ontario. So there are treaty rights. There's not only treaty rights, there's constitutional rights, Section 35 of the Constitution of Canada. There's title rights. There's title to the lake beds and to the river beds that have been ignored. There's inherent rights, which I mentioned, that are articulated in declarations like these, the First Nations Water Declaration. So the Anishinaabe, Mushkegowuk, and Ongwehongwe Water Declaration, and you can find that online. It's pretty articulated and it's pretty succinct in terms of where those inherent rights come from. And then there's the human right to water. So you've seen reports from the David Suzuki Foundation, from Human Rights Watch, and they reference that United Nations international resolution whereby every human has a right to water and to sanitation. So by some of these policies and some of these actions of the settler governments continuing to run roughshod over these rights, and they have all the confidence in the world that there's going to be enough water, but yet the alarm bells are sounding across North America and California. There's droughts. You can see that the maps from NASA and from other science organizations that there's going to be drought around the world, and we're extracting, and they're okay with that. They're extracting massive amounts of water from the Grand River watershed. Yet they will not answer me whether they've completely did 3D aquifer mapping or bedrock mapping. The reply that I got from the Ontario Geological Survey was that we don't know actually the exact volume of water that's in each and every aquifer in the Grand River watershed. So they have this thing called the tertiary watershed, and then they say, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to notify the First Nations that are in that tertiary watershed. They stopped doing that, so they eliminated that need. And then with the last iteration of their regulation, they're devolving that to another level of settler government, so to the municipal government, and they're saying it's up to you, settler government, or the town of Brantford or the city of Brantford. You get to decide whether you get an opinion as to whether the province should issue a permit to take water to Nestlé or to Blue Triton or to any other water bottle company. And they've totally excluded a voice for Six Nations, for our youth and for our women and for our political leadership. So the struggle will continue, and we're going to need support from many facets and disciplines in academia, grassroots organizations to keep the pressure on. We know that there's a provincial election coming in June of next year, so we encourage every constituent to make sure that they talk to their candidates and their MPPs to see where the various parties stand on this whole issue of water security. Right now, they have so much confidence. We're in Southern Ontario. We're surrounded by the Great Lakes. There should be enough fresh water for everyone. In my own community at Six Nations, we have only a very small percentage of folks that are hooked up to the distribution system. So we have a water treatment plant that takes water in from the Grand River, and it's piped to the village of Ashwegan and to a few of the schools. The vast majority of the homes in the community, which is Canada's largest Indian reserve, up to two-thirds of the community still rely on private wells and cisterns and groundwater. Bit by bit, there's some of the governments have committed to expanding the distribution system, but we know that's going to take a long time. In the meantime, there's always this concern that the folks that are on wells, whether they're dug wells, which are 40 foot deep, and they do rely on snow to recharge. We didn't have much snow this past winter, so the trucking of water to fill those 40-foot wells and to fill the cisterns is nonstop year round. And then for those folks that have a drilled well that go into the bedrock, into the aquifer, they say they have every single drilled well has a provincial number assigned to it, a tag. But when you look at that data set, there's no way that they can determine if there's going to be enough water. So those folks one day may try to turn on the tap, and there's going to be no water left. And then what are they going to do? So again, precautionary principles out the window, scientific certainty out the window. So we have all these types of issues at Six Nations. I think I'm going over my time here, but there's so much more I can share. I did mention as part of my presentation, I would quickly mention that we did a trial run. So we had the People's Water Petition, the People of Six Nations Petition. It was just a short campaign after the province ended its moratorium on March 31st. So we with the help of Wellington Water Watchers, we created an online survey. We got quite a few signatures, not as many as if we had the resources to do a more larger community-wide campaign. And so we're going to continue that work with support from grassroots and with neighborhood watches. We need to actually get more resourcing to do neighborhood watching. So some of you may remember that there was the Waterkeeper Alliance. So it was supported with Robert Kennedy, and they got a lot of traction, and we see that more and more. Government funding is being scaled back. It's going to require community-based water monitoring. So we're going to need support for the continuation of those types of groups, grassroots groups, to patrol what's going on with the water. So it's going to be like a waterkeepers campaign that's going to be nonstop if we're going to make sure that we have enough water for future generations. So Mike, I'll just leave it at that for now. I know I didn't touch on all of the bullets. There's some political commentary I wanted to add as well, but I'll just leave it at that because I don't want to take too much time. So yeah.
Thank you, Rod. There will be more opportunity for you to talk, but there's a couple of questions I want to ask you right now, and there are comments in the chat box that you can catch up with. I'm not seeing any questions for you in the chat box yet, but people are clearly reacting in positive ways to what you're saying. And folks, if you have questions for Rod, please put them in the chat box. But I'm going to ask you a very specific question and then a very big general question. My specific question is this. First of all, I have to say that when we talked to the Ministry of the Environment, we said to them, does Blue Triton need to consult with Six Nations? And they said, no, Nestlé has already consulted with Six Nations. And so that's already part of the application. So we said, well, who did they consult with? And the ministry people reported that Nestlé said that they had met with a committee of the Band Council, I believe the Land and Development Committee, and that they had consulted with the traditional leadership, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Council. They have not talked to the elected council. Do you have any comments on this? Do you consider this to be consultation? Do you consider this to be consent? What do you think it means that this has been delegated to Blue Triton and they're going forward?
Yeah, that is a big topic that we could spend all day talking on. So yesterday, Bill C-15, which was Canada's the Senate endorsement, so they crossed a major hurdle now. So the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People has a whole pile of provisions that deal with Indigenous rights to resourcing, to water, and there's actually provisions for compensation and redress when water resources have been confiscated or taken illegally without the permission or the consent of the respective First Nations. So yes, I received the same correspondence from Minister Jeff Urick and from the directors at the province. The same sound bites we hear. Oh, we talked to your consultation coordinator point person, and we've notified. So when I was working for the province, they had this thing called the Interim Aboriginal Notification Strategy, and so but then what they tried to do is they tried to say, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. We're just, it's called modernization of approvals. We're going to trust our science, and we don't feel that we have a need to even notify or consult with respect to First Nations. So how they're doing it now is they're just saying, okay, each under the Ipperwash inquiry, there was the New Relationship Fund, which established a core consultation point person in every First Nation that wanted it. And then subsequently, each provincial ministry went to that one person who does not, we know for a fact, does not have expertise in hydrogeology. And they say, okay, we notified that core consultation point person, check mark. They don't give them enough time to take that information, to digest it. They're not hydrogeologists. They're just taking the word from the engineers and whoever else and the propaganda that they push out. And then there's no timeline or process for that point person to then go back to the community at large and say, oh, hold on a second here. Are there any households that have noticed that their wells have gone dry? Are you having to order more water? Do you have issues with the drilled well water volume? So it's just very shallow. So it's not what would be expected, a 360-degree consultation process. It's just one-dimensional. Go to the point person, send a notice out, and if they feel that they don't respond in the 30 or the 60 or the 90-day EBR posting, that there's no concern. So that's not consultation. And there's Supreme Court decisions that talk about the role that settler governments have to play with, it's called deep consultation. You can read some of those Supreme Court decisions. There's no way that was deep consultation. So my sense is, and I'll just wrap up by saying this, and I've said it a number of times, is that we're at the point now where we're going to have to actually go internationally. If Canada continues to run roughshod over First Nations water rights, we're going to have to, we've already submitted, there's a rotating states around the world get to go to this thing called the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. It's Committee on the Environmental Racial Discrimination. So we've already made a submission there, and you can find the submission from the Chiefs of Ontario that talks about, and you can actually go to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples. So we're actually going to have to take it to an international forum to make sure that the settler governments of Canada, Ontario and Canada, are abiding by international recognition of Indigenous rights to water. So I'll just leave it at that. So I know there's a lot more that I can say.
Rod, I'm going to get you to repeat one thing very simply. So Jennifer Kerr, formerly of Nestlé's, now Blue Triton, the public relations representative, has just joined the webinar. So would you say to Jennifer that Triton Nestlé has failed to consult, and failed to achieve the consent of Six Nations?
100% yes. I mean, there was a representative from Nestlé that came to the previous chief and council, the elected council. They befriended one of the band councillors who's now passed on, and they had a pie chart there, and they said, oh, Six Nations, don't worry. They had the pie chart. They're just tiny little sliver of water that we're taking. Everybody, the municipalities are taking way much more water than Nestlé is taking in its water bottling operation. So, again, that consultation office is not a hydrogeologist. They don't have a science background. They subsequently reached out to me, and I provided my background based on my view. And so no, there's been no consultation. To say that, Nestlé's taking the water, extracting it, and then exporting it out of the tertiary watershed. Those municipalities that are taking the water, yes, every human right needs access to water, but it's being treated and it's being returned to the local tertiary watershed. So, they can do all the propaganda spin that they want, but in my view, and the view of so many, whether it's the youth campaign headed up by Makasha Looking Horse, the clan mothers, there's been no consultation by Nestlé, and there's been no consent from the people of Six Nations on the continuation of that water extraction in the Haldimand deed. So I'll just leave it at that.
I hope Jennifer Kerr's taking notes. Rod, I'm going to ask you one more question, then we're going to move to Sam Demby. And this question is in the chat box. Sometimes we hear that communities that don't have access to clean water need bottled water. I remember actually the former MPP for Guelph, Liz Sandoz, us having a conversation with her and saying, well, we need the bottled water. They don't have clean water on reserves. They need to have bottled water. What do you say to that?
Yeah, so I reflected a lot upon this. So you recall when we went to Flint, Michigan, and the struggle that they dealt with there. Again, they were in a situation where there was lead in their water. They had no choice but in the interim to use bottled water to provide the human need to water. So again, at different jurisdictions and areas across North America, we're going to be at different spaces in this struggle and this fight for water security. And so there's going to be an interim period until we do have a full community-wide distribution system, that we are going to have to transport that water, the potable drinking waters, somehow to our homes. Hopefully, we can launch a campaign where we can encourage the elimination of single-use plastic bottles, or if we do have to resort to that, then let's set up a really aggressive plastic recycling program in the interim to do that, and then shift to the larger plastic bottles, the reusable plastic bottles that you can just fill up and make sure they're rinsed properly and sanitized properly. And then if at some point in the future, which I don't anticipate is going to happen in my lifetime, that we're going to have a community-wide distribution system on the reserve. So yeah, there's that whole issue of how we're going to transport the water, the potable water, back to the community in the interim. Again, it's different communities are at different stages in that struggle to get water security.
So Rod, thank you. I'm going to say something for people to respond to in the chat box, and just in a moment, we're going to hear from Sam Demby. But actually, I've heard some people in Six Nations, and I'm saying this to everybody listening, I'd like you to comment. I've heard some people in Six Nations say that actually the Aberfoyle bottling plant should be rematriated, not repatriated, but rematriated, and be rematriated from Triton Nestlé as reparations, and be turned into a source for providing bulk water, not bottled water, but bulk water on an interim basis to a number of First Nations communities in the interim period until Canada finally provides the resources to these communities deserve under their treaty rights to have operating and reliable water systems. So I'd invite, as we switch speakers now, thank you, Rod, I'd like to ask you to comment in the chat box whether you would support the rematriation of the Aberfoyle site into something like that. That means taking it from Triton and making it available under some form of co-governed public stewardship. Okay, so we're very happy Sam Demby is here with us. Sam's a researcher, a community organizer, a writer. She's focused, I think she'll tell you, on we're doing research into corporations who do extraction. She's looked into the details of the Blue Triton deal for us. We're going to talk about the implications of this. Sam, welcome. Thank you for making time for us today. You're on.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm joining here from Oaxaca, Mexico, and I am from Brooklyn, New York. So I'm not from Canadian territory, but I definitely support the rematriation of the Aberfoyle plant from both the north and the south. So thanks so much, everyone. Thank you, Mike, for that great introduction, and thank you so much, Rod, for giving us that crucial orientation of the First Nations Water Declaration. So kind of continuing the thread here, I'm going to lead us through really digging into what it means that Nestlé Waters North America is now in the hands of private equity firms. Oh, and I guess I'll just say a little bit more about my work. Since around March, I've been working with the Troubled Waters Coalition, mostly doing corporate research into what this deal means. And as Mike said, I'm a community organizer. I've worked mostly with First Nations and Indigenous peoples in Mexico and Central America, and a little bit in North America around land and water rights issues. And in my kind of writing and research, I touch on the same issues. So you can take us to the next slide now, and we'll just go straight into what this deal means. So as Mike said, in March of this year, Nestle sold its struggling North American bottled water brands to a pair of private equity firms, OneRock Capital Partners and Metropolous Co. So who are these private equity firms? What are we dealing with? OneRock Capital Partners is an investment firm that grew out of the Mitsubishi Corporation and that still maintains strong ties to that corporation. And Metropolous Co. is the investment firm that we're really going to zoom in on and try to understand how they operate so that we get a sense of what this deal means for the communities and ecosystems and local economies that are impacted by Blue Triton's bottled water operations. And that's because Metropolous has a kind of much more public, well-documented track record. And so we'll really be digging into how they operate and looking at some case studies so that we can try to get a sense of what this deal means for communities like those of the folks who are assisting this webinar. So in April, as you know, the company revamped its corporate identity as Blue Triton Brands. And as Mike mentioned, especially on the local level, there's been this effort to kind of pass off this $4.3 billion sale to new owners as a kind of name change. And as we'll see, Blue Triton's new chairman and CEO, who's the billionaire investor Dean Metropolous, wields considerable control over the company. And it's important to emphasize that Dean Metropolous has a very, very different vision for the company than Nestle did. And as the company's new chairman and CEO, he has considerable power to change the shape, to kind of shape the trajectory that this company is going to take. So it's important to emphasize that this is in no way just a name change. It's a significant change in ownership, in leadership, and in the direction of this company. And for that very reason, it'll have very different consequences for the communities and ecosystems and natural resources that are impacted. So you can take us to the next slide. So Metropolous Co. is an investment firm that has a reputation for buying up classic but struggling American brands, Twinkies, Pabst Blue Ribbon, Chef Boyardee, Aunt Jemima. So that's really been the specialty of this investment firm. Many times they'll buy up these brands when they're already in a process of bankruptcy, and that has certain implications. Often they no longer have to abide by union regulations, etc. So as Mike mentioned, and I'll reiterate it because it's worth reiterating, Metropolous is not a buy and hold company like Nestle. It's a buy and sell company. So what does that mean? On a very basic level, a buy and hold company makes money through operating a business, but Metropolous doesn't make money primarily through the operation of a business. It makes money by buying and selling the company. So what is Metropolis's way to operate? They acquire underperforming brands, streamline operations to cut costs, implement risky financial tools to extract as much value as possible and make as big payouts to shareholders as possible before selling to investors at a profit. I saw someone in the chat saying flipping companies. What does that mean? It's like flipping a house. I buy a house that's, I mean, it's not exactly like flipping a house, but the metaphor can serve us up to a certain point. I buy a house that's run down, that's not doing so well. I make a bunch of renovations and I sell it as quickly as possible so that I can generate a profit. Only in this case, the difference is that Metropolous isn't really interested in making long-term structural improvements to the company, but rather in extracting value for shareholders. So you can take us to the next slide, please. So we're going to take a look at the most prominent acquisition and sale that Metropolous has carried out. And hopefully this can give us an idea of what might happen with the Nestlé Waters North America assets, which, as you know, include brands like Poland Spring and Pure Life, etc. So the Twinkies case is a good one for us to look at because just like Nestlé Waters North America, it's a very prominent public company and it's underperforming. In fact, Twinkies was bankrupt. Nestle wasn't in that position, but definitely financially wasn't performing as they wanted to, and was, as Mike mentioned, suffering from kind of national and international community organizing. So what did Metropolous do with Hostess? Metropolous purchased Hostess with a $500 million leveraged buyout. A leveraged buyout refers to the acquisition of a company funded primarily through debt. So usually it's about 90% debt and 10% equity, meaning just the cash that the companies actually have and put out for that purchase. So leverage buyouts are popular because they enable a large company acquisition, but with minimal capital and with less risk, because the company that's acquired and not the companies that are purchasing are the ones who end up, is the one who's ending up with the debt in the long run. So the purchasers have a little bit less risk there. And that was in 2012 that purchase of Twinkies happened. And by 2016, the private equity firm sold the company for a nearly $2 billion gain. Metropolous acquired that company with an investing partner called Apollo Global Management. So what happened between 2012 and 2016 for Metropolous and Apollo to extract $2 billion gain from that company, from Hostess? From 2012 to 2016, the company's new owners streamlined operations. They cut jobs, they cut wages, they outsourced labor, they shunned and busted unions. Production became highly automated. Unsafe working conditions were condoned. One major factory was reopened, only to close a year later, leading over 400 people to lose their jobs. And the company said that they were not able to inform workers that the whole time their plan was just to open for a year to meet production needs because of labor laws. So in short, communities, local economies, workers suffered, and that enabled the company to extract value. How did they do that? They employed risky financial tools like dividend recapitalization and tax arrangements in order to make large payouts to shareholders. It's not so important to go into the details of what those financial term means. It just means that they're high risk financial tools involving a lot of debt for the company and involving large payouts to shareholders focused on short-term profit. And Metropolous has used some of these same strategies to buy and sell brands like Pabst Brewing Company and Bumblebee Tuna. So you can go on to the next slide. So I just want to focus on a few aspects of the Metropolous playbook. We're using this Twinkies case study to kind of try to draw out how does Metropolous operate and what might happen with the bottled water brands that are now owned under Blue Triton. So the first key part of the playbook, which is already in play in the Nestle deal, is the leverage buyout. To acquire Nestlé Waters North America Inc., Metropolous and OneRock used $1.1 billion of their own cash, a $350 million line of credit, and a whopping $3.2 billion of junk bonds. So the bulk of the purchase was made with this high interest, high yield loans that are due in 2028, in 7 years. So what does that mean? It means that there's a strong incentive for the investment firms to sell Blue Triton before these loans are due in 2028. And this is a key part of how Metropolous operates. In the investment banking world in general, and in the Metropolous playbook in particular, this whole process of buying up a brand, streamlining operations, cutting costs, and then selling to new investors at a profit usually only takes between 3 and 7 years. And actually that short-term exit strategy is really spelled out and written into the very first page of the Metropolous playbook, the leverage buyout, in the sense that these are short-term loans with high interest, and the company has a strong incentive to sell before those loans are due. The second page of the Metropolous playbook is to cut costs and extract wealth and make payouts to shareholders, which is exactly what we saw happen with the Hostess company. And I want to focus on one last aspect of the Metropolous playbook, which has become an increasingly popular tool that this billionaire investor is using in the companies that he's operating in. In 2016, when Metropolous and Apollo sold Hostess, they didn't just sell it to anybody. They sold it to something called a special purpose acquisition company, which is known as a SPAC, in which they retained a 42% ownership stake, ensuring that they could keep extracting wealth from that company for years to come, but with reduced risk. So what's a SPAC? A SPAC is also known as a blank check company, and it's basically a shell-like corporation that goes public with the sole aim of raising cash to acquire an unspecified private company. So that's why it's called the blank check company. Basically, SPACs have become popular because usually when a company goes public, it's an IPO, right? An initial public offering. And that's a long-term, very regulation heavy, costly process. A SPAC allows companies to go public just by being acquired by another company that's like a shell company that raises money for the purpose of acquiring companies. So without going too deep into how SPACs operate, we know that they're like shell corporations. And the key point here is that financial studies have time and time again concluded that SPACs tend to perform, that companies acquired by SPACs tend to perform more poorly than the broader market. So the summary is that most SPACs have nothing to do with companies' long-term performance and everything to do with quick profit for opportunistic investors. So we can't say if eventually a SPAC will be involved, but it's highly likely that at the end of the day, a SPAC might acquire Nestlé within a few years' time. So this pretty much sums up the Metropolous playbook from the starting point of junk debt to the final point of blank checks. In sum, what can we expect from Blue Triton's bottled water brands under the ownership of Metropolous and OneRock? I would say that from looking at Metropolis's acquisitions over the past decades, which are very well documented, they give us a pretty good sense of what can we expect, which is most likely modifications geared towards short-term profit with no regard for the long-term health of the company, let alone workers, local economies, community assets, and natural resources. So hopefully I haven't gone too over time. I'll leave it there, and thank you so much.
Wow, Sam, that's terrific. There's lots of reaction in the chat box. I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Metropolous is asking for a 10-year permit to take water. Do you think Triton's going to be here in 10 years based on what you know from their playbook?
I definitely wouldn't imagine Triton to be there in 10 years. Like I said, these deals usually take place from 3 to 7 years, and the loans are due in 7 years. So there's a really strong financial incentive for the company to sell before the loans are due in 2028. It's possible that Blue Triton would sell to a SPAC, to this shell-like entity in which they retain a stake. But again, that would be a different corporate entity. So pretty much on the local level, what does this mean for communities, for counties, for local commissioners? I don't know what you call them in Canada. Sorry, I'm using US terms. On the local level, this means that all of the folks who are having to deal with renegotiating permits, with that whole headache, with all of that financial burden, with all the energy that takes, are likely going to have to deal with that again in a few years' time, depending on local or regional rules about what's necessary when a new corporate entity takes over. So it's very likely that I would say that definitely I don't expect Blue Triton to be around in 10 years. Maybe a shell-like entity that enables them to keep extracting wealth from the company, but not in the same capacity. And very likely the communities having to deal with renegotiating permits with a Wall Street investor that's pretty much interested in profit and indifferent to environmental concerns and to community agreements, will very likely have to deal in a few years' time with a new set of investors that are equally indifferent to community and to environmental concerns.
Now, Sam, I'm going to go sideways for a minute. Lots of people, I shouldn't say lots of people, some people criticize the water watchers for opposing Nestlé by saying, why don't you oppose other businesses that take water and turn them into products? And we say that one of the reasons, we have concerns about Coca-Cola, for example, and their plastic bottles and their taking of water and making a product. However, our deepest concern with Nestlé all along has been that they're in the water profiteering business. They're taking water, which, as Rod Whitlow says, is life, and which we all know is essential to all forms of life. They're taking it essentially for free. They're selling it and making huge profits. They're exporting those profits to their headquarters in Switzerland, and they're leaving all the plastic garbage, environmental damage behind. But the commodification of water has always been the main point of our resistance to Nestlé. Is this worse? Is what Metropolis is doing in the kind of way that they're investing in financializing, and that might be a word you explain for us, financializing water, is this an even more ominous development?
I think so. I think it's a different stage that we're seeing in general. I think this stage has probably been in development for a long time, but in last winter, California opened up its state market for water speculation, for water futures, and there's been a lot of press recently in the western part of the U.S. Where water resources are particularly scarce, about private equity and investment firms buying up water resources. It's kind of this new dark era. Well, for I think for communities, it can be a little bit dark, of water speculation. So I think beyond the commodification of water and profiteering, this is the speculative commodification of water. We're looking at a climate crisis scenario in which we expect water resources to be ever more scarce. And so companies aren't just profiting off of the extraction and sale of water, they're profiting off of the projected scarcity of water and the ownership and capacity to make additional profit because they expect water to be ever more scarce. So there's some of this at play here. I think in the particular case of Blue Triton, there's an additional layer because it's not just a commodification in the buy and hold sense of, okay, I'm going to hold on to this company, basically get access to these water resources for free or for a minimal price and profit off of the sale of that water. It's not just water mining. The companies are sort of setting out to mine communities more broadly. So they're mining the company itself, extracting wealth from workers, from local factories, from local economies, and kind of trying to distribute and transfer that wealth to shareholders, including themselves. So I do think it's a deeper level of disinterest and lack of commitment to communities. Nestlé, when I was doing interviews with troubled water folks, one thing I feel like I heard time and time again was, Nestlé, at least they have some interest in their reputation as a company that follows through on community benefits, that's committed to community well-being, even if most of that, and the communities on the ground will be the judges of this, even if a lot of that is kind of more propaganda than actually real hard long-term community commitment and investment. But at least they have an interest in that. Whereas I think Metropolous and OneRock, as private equity investors that are likely planning to hold on to this company for a few years, make modifications geared more towards short-term profit, they don't really have that kind of commitment, or even that their reputation hinges on the capacity to make a good deal, to buy up a company and turn it for a profit. So I do think it is a different beast in that sense.
I think you make two very interesting points here. A term I think we're going to hang on to here, Sam, is that this is speculative. They're speculating, they're betting on water scarcity, which is not to get Nestlé off the hook, because they do lots of land banking. They do lots of land acquisition in South America, for example. They control the land over whole aquifers. So they're not good guys, but there is another level here. But the other thing that I think you're drawing out that's really important here is that the audience, the stakeholder, the constituency that Metropolous and OneRock care about is investors, not the public. They don't care about the public. They're going to have to do a limited amount of blue washing to keep their brand going. But as you say, Nestle at least had a brand to protect. And as we said off the top, it was probably in protection of their brand that they've retreated from the North American market in order to protect their brand and protect the businesses that they want to hold. But I think you're making a very important point here. Metropolous, OneRock, they don't care. They don't care about the public at all. Sam, there's a question that's kind of a strategy question that I'm going to ask you in the chat box. And there's a little story I'm going to tell, and then we're going to move on to Shane. So I'm giving Shane a kind of a 3-minute warning here. There's increasing movement. This is a question, strategy question from the chat box. Andrea Mulebach says there's increasing movement against exactly these kinds of companies, BlackRock, etc., entering or having entered the real estate market, for example, in the Greater Toronto area, for the same reasons we're opposing Triton. And she thinks Andrea thinks the focus on water here is crucial, but it might be worth thinking about coalitions with other groups that are fighting other entities like BlackRock, like Metropolous. What's your comment on that?
I think that's a really important point. I think in this new scenario in which we're dealing with different kinds of corporations and different kinds of financial entities, we do need to rethink, or it's worth rethinking our alliances and our forms of organizing. I think, we can't really separate land and water. In recent research that I've been doing on the financialization of water and kind of this speculative acquisition of water resources, it's pretty common for companies to buy up land. And even kind of, there was a famous case, I think a few years back, where Harvard is, a university, but it's also has a huge endowment that pretty much operates like a private equity firm. And they started having vineyards in California. And there was a lot of press around that because the interest in this particular zone in California and in that land was because there were groundwater resources involved. And so I think it is worth kind of making connections with other folks who are impacted more broadly by the financial speculation on natural resources. This kind of sense that water and land and agricultural resources and all of the things that nature gives us so generously so that we can survive are increasingly being turned over to private equity firms that have little interest in long-term well-being of the land, of water, and of the communities that depend on them. And so I do think there's a lot of possibilities to kind of more broadly rethink our coalitions and our alliances. And as as corporations, as the corporations that we're dealing with kind of change their face, kind of to adapt and explore new territories in that sense. I think that's a great point. Thanks so much for that comment.
You know, I want to just connect briefly, Sam, what you're saying back to what Rod Whitlow was saying to make the connection is that, you know, land acquisition is the foundation of the colonial project, and the colonial project's not over. It's ongoing. And as in Canada, with the recent revelation to the broader public of the mass grave of the children in Kamloops, it's not history. It's our present, and unless we all act together, it's our future. And the colonial project of land acquisition is ongoing. And whereas we know that in the past the empires were corporations too, but it has shifted from being nation states to being these multinationals that are now the colonizers. Sam, I'm just going to make a comment. There won't be, I don't think it's a question here for you, but you may want to respond. Just to come back to the workers for a second. So the Nestlé workers are not unionized, which is unfortunate for them. They work in minimum wage jobs. And we actually have great sympathy and solidarity with the Nestlé workers. And in whatever happens, we wish for and would be willing partners in a just transition for those workers. But you mentioned that Metropolis has a history of union busting. But also automation. And I just wanted to connect the dots here for a second. You know, the Water Watchers went to Vittel, France as part of a fact-finding tour in the spring of 2019. And we learned that at the Vittel plant, there had been 4,000 workers. They were now down to 2,000 workers as a result of automation. And Nestlé was publicly saying in the community, their goal was to get down under 1,000 workers. So, you know, those jobs are disappearing. And, you know, one of the partners in our Troubled Waters Coalition, the people in our Santa Fe River Incorporated, who are fighting Nestle in the Ginny Springs area, and there's lots of media around all that. It's a complicated situation in Florida, where Nestle doesn't actually have the bottling plant. They're buying water from the bottling plant and reselling it. That there's a very vigorous, we just learned a very vigorous automation program going on down there, all as part of repackaging it for Metropolis. So I'd be very, you know, if I was a worker at Nestlé's here, I'd be very alert to what's going on with automation, which is one of the, I bring this up because one of the questions in the chat box would be, what are the danger signs we should be looking for? And, you know, if I was a Nestlé worker or a Blue Triton worker now, I'd be paying close attention to what's happening with automation in that plant. So Sam, thank you very much. This is very interesting. And folks, while you have this recording, we also have some background documents that Sam has prepared for us that we'll make available to you. And Shane, welcoming Shane to the microphone, to the virtual stage now. And Shane has been really personifying for us walking the talk, and the pandemic has been difficult for all of us in many, many ways, and it's a whole other conversation about the pandemic. One of the consequences of the pandemic is we're not able to meet in person very much, and so Shane has stepped forward to kind of personify this, and it's really been terrific. And he did a walk of 5 days and was joined by 3 or 4 or 5 people as could be under the public health measures that we had. And we're calling this the Ear to the Groundwater Tour. And Shane is a singer and a songwriter and a social justice activist and much, much more. So Shane, we're very pleased that you're on this walk. And I know you're going to do kind of a highlights of the walk for us. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and then we'll come back and have some conversation. Take it away, Shane.
All right, thanks, Mike. Great to be here with all of you. I didn't realize there was going to be so many people. I would have maybe wrote down some of the highlights that I'd like to share, but I'll generally always just speak from my heart, because that, in a lot of ways, is why I walk. And you know, we have this issue with water, but for me, it's always been an issue of equality. And if you are like the only person growing up in a rural farm town in Canada, and you're the only Black person in that town, what equality means becomes very powerful. And then when you start traveling the world and you understand your privilege, regardless of any of the issues you faced at home, when you see people that don't have the opportunities that I have, I felt so grateful regardless of any of the inequities I faced at home in Canada. And so for me, I understand the environmental impact. I understand the health impact of bottling water. As one of my other practices, I'm a health consultant for people. So I sit down with people and I evaluate what they're doing wrong in their life and what they're doing right and how they can improve their overall vitality and their overall health. I'm also a social worker with homeless teens in Guelph. I've worked with homeless teens in Manhattan and New York City as a mentor. Just being an older person of color, helping these kids understand that they do have opportunities in life that they just need to see or uncover. And you know, my dad and mom, they came here a long time ago. They met here in this small town, but they're from a small little state in the south of Kerala, in the south of India called Kerala. And this is where Coca-Cola was pumping tons of water to make their product, not too far from my mom's hometown, and drying up the wells for farmers there. And you could imagine what that would be like here. You get social assistance in Canada, but guess what happens in India or in Africa? When you start traveling, you understand that people have nothing if they don't have water, and they don't have a government to help them out. And these foreign corporations, mainly set in the Western world, go into these countries and take their water. And in most cases, taking our soul. So when I walk here, I'm like reaching out to those people across the world in my heart. And I think people here have developed a sense of apathy for what goes on in the rest of the world. If it's not in your own backyard, then it doesn't matter. If Nestlé's in your backyard, it's fine, as long as it's not in mine. And to me, the issue at hand is social justice, is equality. And so when I walk with my brothers and sisters, First Nations brothers and sisters, I'm walking with them in solidarity on this land, because I know what it's like to be in my parents' land, whether it's in East Africa, whether it's in Palestine, or whether it's in India. We have many ancestors that go way back 2,000 years. And I understand that this happens across the globe, but a lot of this fight has to be fought in solidarity here in Canada. And so that's been the inspiration to walk, is to walk for equality with people of this land and say enough's enough. If you really talk the talk on equality about people from different backgrounds or different ethnicities or different social economic backgrounds, if you say you really do care about poor people, if you say you really do care about Black and brown people, or people from Asia, whether it's Uyghurs in China or Vietnamese people sewing your shoes, I mean, there has to be a minimal amount of care when it comes to your dollar on what you do with it. There has to be a minimal amount of awareness that every dollar you spend either supports a better world or supports Nestlé and other global titans that will rip apart this world. And so, you know, when we're walking together, I'm walking with that in my heart, and I'm asking people to open your hearts. This is all a mind game, but if you don't feel the pain that other people go in other parts of the world, then, you know, it'll just stay in your mind. It'll be a game that corporations will win all the time because they're not built to have empathy. They're meant to hire firms that will reach out with their public relations officer. But if you ask those public relations officer, am I equal? Then show me how I'm equal. Show me that that treaty is being honored. Show me by making sure that there is clean water in our nations, in our whole nation, for all people, for all First Nations. Show me that. Show me that there's clean water. There shouldn't have to be bottled water advisories, boiled water advisories. You shouldn't have to ship water to them. You should have a pipe in the ground. And so, like, walking, as you can see, I'm walking with these strong women here in this picture. We got there, and I don't know what's going to happen. There's OPP around. I don't know. I'm the only Black person there, but I have to take a stand, you know. And I'm asking people of all backgrounds, all solidarity, to come together on this issue. Because if you don't have clarity with this specific issue, every other issue, I think, starts to fall by the wayside, because it just becomes my issue. That's your issue. This is their issue. And so I think we have a real great opportunity here to unite under humanity's banner of water, to be able to say that we understand that water is life. And we understand that equality starts with water, clean water. And then we can go to clean food. And then we can go to safe housing. You know, I understand this as a social worker with vulnerable people. And, you know, as an artist, I've understood that for the things that I love to do, I've had to tread lightly in this world and not ask of too much. So you can see I'm sleeping in a tent. Well, if you know what artists do for their love in life, they'll sleep in a ditch if they have to. But they're happy doing it, you know, and I'm happy walking. It doesn't anger me. It saddens me that public relations for Nestlé or for Triton are employed by people that still refuse to look in the mirror and understand their own personal humanity and how they can make a change in this world. I'm willing to walk as long as it takes. And, you know, through the first long walk, I walked through major sun. I could feel my skin, you know, it was hot. It was hot. My skin wasn't necessarily happy. And then my prayer was answered. You know, I got a thunderstorm. And it was a beautiful feeling. But even that day, as all you Canadians understand, there was that tragedy in London, Ontario. And even that day, and maybe I could share with you like a little anecdotal snippet of my life and people like me. But that day, walking for 4 hours in the sun, trying to take a break on someone's lawn, I was confronted by a woman, an old German white woman who was deaf in one ear and was very scared that I was sitting on her lawn, like 100 feet from her house, having having food, because she was scared of what happened the day before. And she actually thought that something was going to happen to her right away for me sitting on her lawn having my my meal break in a 6-hour walk. And her husband, this old elderly man, he was yelling at her not to go near me because she was taught to be scared of me. And this is what we're being taught, whether it's media or whether it's our parents or cultural. We're taught to be scared of each other and not to unite with each other. And after talking with her through my lunch break for at least 15, 20 minutes while Arlene was finding me a cup of coffee, she finally said, and was now standing within 6 feet of me, she said, "I don't have to be scared of you. You can eat on my front lawn." You know, I don't know how many people get to experience that in life, but for me, that's a transformative experience. And I'm willing to have those conversations with people. And I think we all need to understand that water is that uniting spirit that brings us all together and allows us all to fight the common fight, which is peace and love, unity on this planet. Yeah, my dad always said, "Shane, you should write music that means something for the starving kids in Africa and India." And, you know, I'm trying to write those songs now, and I'm trying to walk the walk. And you have to start in your own backyard. And so I say to the people of Elora, I say to the people of Fergus and Guelph, this is a common fight right now, I believe, for equality for Indigenous people on this land and their right to determine how water is treated, to work within their law of administering this precious resource of life. And I think if we're able to allow Indigenous people of this land to administer that right, then a lot of this problem will start to heal itself, especially with the younger generation coming up, understand that you don't need to sacrifice your principles to move forward in this world. And you don't need a whole lot in this world to be happy. Yeah, so, you know, being able to walk from town to town and talk to people, you know, is just educating people on the issue. And a lot of people still don't know the issue exists. You know, they come, either they're a new immigrant or they've been here for a long time and they just don't understand the preciousness of water. And so I've had the chance to sit down with people and take breaks and explain to them, listen, if you view each other as equal, but you understand that some people don't have water and some people, would you be willing to give up your bottled water and drink from the tap? And they said, yeah, absolutely. But there's no consensus on it yet. People don't understand that this is the question that they need to be answering. And so, you know, yeah, I'll continue to walk and see what kind of change we can make and awareness, either just locally or globally. Walking the walk and bringing the spirit of my ancestors from Palestine, Ethiopia, and Kerala, and walk with them on this land with the spirits of the ancestors here, because we walk together always.
That's a good spot, Shane.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say?
No, I mean, yeah, it's really, you know, Mike, I know you get it. I know you get me. And like, there's so many fights we can be fighting in this world. And I think as a person of color from Indian and East African heritage, I've said to you many times is that, I know we're all equal. I walk that way. I know it in my heart. I feel it. And so that's what gives me the courage to walk into a stranger's land and say, I belong here regardless. That's what spirit and spirit teaches all of us. We belong here. Do you feel it? And I feel that every day.
Shane, you're bringing a tremendous gift to the work that all of us are doing, and in the walking that you're doing, and in the way you're feeling it and talking about it. And I want to say to everybody who's listening that one of the things that we're calling this the Ear to the Groundwater Tour, and Shane's listening and he's reflecting and he's listening to people and he's listening to the groundwater, and he's performing a song at every stop that he makes. And one of the things that we're hoping will come out of this is that we've invited Shane to contemplate these and he's doing a couple of other walks as well, and to write some songs. And so we're hoping that in September, Shane's final report, quote unquote, from his walking tour will be a performance. And we're looking forward to that possibility. And because I want to say this, and it comes to me as I listen to you speak, Shane, that the work that we're all involved in, the movement that we're all involved in, it's a social movement. It's a connecting with each other. It's a solidarity movement. Whether that solidarity is in the specifics, Shane, of your conversation with that couple on the rural road, or with a solidarity with First Nations in the way that Rod described at the beginning of this. So it has a social solidarity aspect to it. It has a political aspect to it, because it's organizing to build the power of people to make governments take the actions that protect our communities, create equality, create equity, protect the environment, protect the natural home that we live in. And it's also spiritual. And I think that's reflected in the way you talk about this, Shane, the way you feel it. And, I just want to do a little shout out while I can here for a moment to the Sisters of St. Joseph, and to which is a clear example of the intersection of the spiritual work and the social work and the solidarity work that we're doing on the ground. So it's very important, Shane. And as I hope you get a chance to read what's in the chat box, because people are showing you lots of love and affection and appreciation for what you're doing, because we can talk about these things, but we need to walk our talk. And you're being our proxy in these difficult times for walking our talk. We appreciate that. And as the public health measures ease, we hope more and more people will be able to join you. And I know that you welcome people joining you on the walk. We have a couple of more walks coming up. We're not going to say too much about them right now, but we have a couple more walks planned over the summer, and we'll be sharing information with you about that. I think that I'm watching the clock. I think we're going to go into our closing summary now. The thing that came to me in terms of connecting the dots, and as you were speaking, Shane, is I'm remembering a saying. It's a saying that I've trained. My background is community organizing and campaigning. I come from outside the environmental movement originally, and my training started off as a social worker doing community development work. And something I heard in my very early training that always stuck with me is a saying that's attributed to an Aboriginal woman from Australia. I believe her name is Alice. And the saying goes like this: if you're here to help me, go away. But If your liberation is somehow tied up with mine, let's get to work.
Yeah.
And I feel that that's what we're trying to do here, and what you're helping to exemplify for us, Shane, is that our liberation, I hope this is reflected in the conversations we've had today, that the liberation of First Nations people and the liberation of people from racialized communities and the liberation of all of us from the colonial project and the corporate profiteering, that's our shared liberation work. That's what we have in common, and it's social liberation, and it's political liberation, and it's spiritual liberation. So this is the work that we're engaged in together. We're very happy, everyone who's been here today with us. There's been lots of positive comments in the chat box. We've had a high level of people staying engaged through this presentation. I want to say just maybe a couple of take action things going forward, partly to forecast our strategy and to say a couple of specific things. So we can make comments opposing Triton's permit to take water through the Environmental Registry of Ontario up until June 22nd. We've done, if you're on a Water Watcher mailing list, we've done a couple of mail outs to you about that. I think I'm saying this to my friends, my colleagues who are producing the show here, that I think we're going to put in the chat box a link. Yep, there it is. So you can submit comments to the ERO through that link. Pardon me. As part of the next phase of the campaign, we're asking people to write letters to the editor after June 22nd, to expand the lens about all of the reasons why this Triton's water taking is an ominous, dangerous development that's not in the public interest. So there's a letter writing workshop you can sign up for. You'll see again that link there. And there are additional tours, walking tours, as part of the Ear to the Groundwater Tour, which is part of our larger initiative which we call the which is year 2 of the People's Water Campaign. And we had a terrific convention last year. More than 500 people attended, and the second annual People's Water Convention will be October 2nd. There'll be advertising around that. You can make a note if you like now. But I'm now going to, the other thing you can do in terms of taking action is make a donation to the Water Watchers. And I'm going to, some of you who've been in sessions with me before know I do a kind of an advocacy auction to raise money, and we're not going to do that today. But it does feel a little bit like PBS, like telethon, like public broadcasting system. And so there is a donation link in the box. And what I want to say is this, here's the PBS part. If you enjoyed this webinar, if you enjoy the work the Water Watchers does, then please make a donation. And you can make a one-time donation. And what's really helpful to us, which really helps us plan with confidence, is if you become a monthly donor. And again, this is the PBS sounding like part of it. I want to now kind of sharpen my message and say this. The campaign to protect water, the campaign against Nestlé, the campaign against water profiteering, there are many allies. Council of Canadians has worked on this for years. We've worked closely together. There are other organizations in other places. There are many allies in all this. And when it comes to Nestlé in Wellington County, the Wellington Water Watchers are and have been the sharp end of the stick. And in order to be the sharp end of the stick, we have to polish that. We have to hone that. We have to hone that part of the stick, and we have to have people who are willing to pick that stick up and beat Nestlé with it, and beat our governments into doing the right thing around water bottling. And folks, to be able to do that, to be able to take on the provincial government, to be able to take on Nestlé's, we need your support. We don't get core funding. We don't apply for government grants. We're really empowered by the donations of individuals like you. That enables us to take the stands that we take. It enables us to engage people, because it's really the movement of all of us. The work of the Water Watchers staff is to motivate, animate, engage, build solidarity, and bring people into the movement to protect water. So I urge you, I'm going to ask my friends to put the donation in the link one more time, donation link in the chat box one more time. I encourage you to go there and make a donation to us today or tomorrow or the day after that. It will also help us sponsor the next leg, the next walk in the Ear to the Groundwater Tour. And it allows us to plan with confidence when people make donations. So thank you very much. I'm going to do a round of thank yous now. I'm going to thank, first of all, Rod Whitlow for joining us. Thanks, Sam Denby. Thanks, Shane Phillips, for joining us today and for all that you're doing into the, all that you're doing. I got distracted by one of the comments in the chat box. Shane, all that you're doing to support our walks over the summer. Thank you, Arlene, for your leadership of the Water Watchers and for the land acknowledgement. Thank you to everybody who joined us today and is either listening for the first time or has been here with us many times in webinars like this and has been with us in the campaign and the ongoing movement to protect water. Water's for life. It's not for profit. It's not for Wall Street. And because water is what we love socially, spiritually, politically, we must protect what we love. As a last thank you, I just want to call Danny and Megan and Horeen onto the screen briefly. They're the Water Watcher production team that's behind the show, that's organized us all to be here, who's coordinated it all. I hope they've turned their cameras on for a minute. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We're going to leave the, we're wrapping up, or we're going to leave the screen on for a little while so that you can either make, so we actually want you to make comments in the chat box, any closing comments, how this event was for you today, any last thoughts that you want to share. So we're going to leave the Zoom on for the next 4 or 5 minutes so that you can do that. Thank you for joining us today. For those of you who were speakers, we have sent you a separate Zoom link so that we can have a short debrief conversation. And thank you again one more time personally for being part of today. Folks, we'll see you virtually again, and very, very soon as the public health measures ease, we'll be able to meet again and we'll be able to see you in the streets. Take care, everybody. See you next time.